I'm Stephen Foskett, publisher of Gestalt IT and organizer of Tech Field Day. We are here at Cloud Field Day in Boston, and I brought in an old friend and somebody who's been to a lot of Tech Field Day events before, Ethan Banks, to join us for Cloud Field Day. But of course, behind the scenes at Field Day, we're always talking tech. We're always talking various aspects of technology, and network automation is a huge topic right now. But what the heck even is network automation?
Network automation is a lot of things, depending on how you want to define it. Now, on the one hand, it could be simply, I am doing some kind of automated gathering of my network. I want to know my network state. I want to get a report on where my network is at, how it complies with certain regulatory standards. I want to just understand where my network is. Network automation could also be, though, pushing changes down into the network so that you get to a desired state. That is yet another definition of network automation. Most people that are doing network automation start with, what is my network? And it's more of a read-only exercise. They are information gathering on the network. They'll advance into network automation of, I want the network to look like this, some golden configuration, and then pushing that network state down into the network itself, making sure that it stays that way so that you've got some immutable architecture that you're starting from, and then automating the creation and preservation of that state going forward. Only it's really hard, Stephen.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I don't know. I don't understand why it's hard. I mean, you get a switch and you plug in some cables and then you plug them into some devices and your network is good. What are you automating?
What are you automating? So it's hard for a lot of reasons. On the one hand, you've got all these different vendors. There is no standard API. There is no one way that you communicate with a network device. The way data is represented changes from vendor to vendor and device to device. Things as straightforward as a MAC address for Ethernet devices are going to vary, and you have to get all that data normalized. There's various interfaces to access the network devices. There's some devices are CLI only. A lot of devices have an API, but again, the APIs will be different from device to device. The methods of communication that are supported vary from device to device. The kind of telemetry you can pull from the devices varies. So that all makes it hard. It makes it complicated because you don't have a standard way to approach the problem. The data and the interfaces that you're using vary widely, and so a lot of the complexity that you find in network automation tooling is tied to trying to get you to a normalized state where you're just using one interface, one set of tools, so that you can actually talk to the network in a predictable way. So that's a thing. Another thing is that we're trying, and this is true whether it's just network automation or infrastructure automation more broadly. When you're dealing with infrastructure as code, you are typically taking tools that were designed for developers, that were designed to push applications into an infrastructure stack, let's say, and deploy that code. You're taking those concepts, that tooling, and trying to apply it to infrastructure, a malleable but physical thing. So yeah, we can have configurations that live in a text file maybe, or that are defined by a Python Jinja template, and get some standardization that way. But this isn't an application that can be so easily torn down and brought back up again. There's a lot of consequences to changing infrastructure and networking specifically. The consequences, the fault domain, the blast domain, if things go wrong, is bad. And so therefore, the practice that you have to build around network automation becomes complicated because you have to have a lot of checks and balances that you put in place to make sure that what you are pushing down into the network is in fact going to work, and that you can back it out if it doesn't. And there's a lot to that.
Yeah. Well, one more thing that I want to kind of touch on here before we go is, traditionally there's been a huge gap between kind of interesting areas of IT like storage and boring areas of IT like networking. And I'm wondering, in your view, does that gap really remain? I mean, because it really shouldn't, because as you said, infrastructure as code and cloud, honestly, storage and networking and compute and everything else, they're all part of the same thing. There is no more verticalization, but it seems like there is. Is there still a gap between networking and the rest of the stuff?
There is a gap in the sense that, the blast domain can be huge. There's not, in that automating infrastructure, every domain has the same sets of problems. So infrastructure automation is got a common set of problems with interfaces and deploying a golden state and dealing with version control and so on. So in that sense, there isn't a gap or everyone's beginning to look at the problem in the same way, and so the gap is closing in that way. We are rapidly moving to a place where how we manage infrastructure, I believe, we're going to treat it as one unified stack. Networking is going to just be part of it, moving along. I talked to a startup this morning. They're still in stealth mode, but at least this much is public. The company is OpsMill. They are starting with network automation being a source of truth for the network, but they're going to move into other infrastructure areas because, as they've been talking to people who make infrastructure as code tooling, they're finding that the problem domain is common among everybody. And so where does that leave network automation and the gap? That gap is closing, and eventually it disappears, and we look at infrastructure as one unified stack.
Yeah, I really think it has to. I will say, though, as a sort of a warning to companies, to people who are trying to do this, in my experience, people tend to come at the problem, the unified problem, from one of these directions, and they tend to come in with a networking solution that allegedly does everything, or with a compute solution that allegedly does networking and storage, or a storage solution that doesn't do anything. And yet, what we really need is a true unification. What we really need is for all of these people to get together and sit around the same table and design a product together. And hopefully we'll see that in the future. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm always excited about what you're doing with Packet Pushers, and we'll be listening and watching here at Cloud Field Day.
Thank you, Stephen. It's nice to be here.